The beauty industry regularly comes up with new marketing claims, some of which sound great, and some of which sometimes totally stop me in my tracks, as I stand there horrified at the sheer audacity of a particular brand saying something that is just so blatantly untrue. And today's podcast topic is all about one of those examples, where we look at the topic of fossil fuel-free beauty. Now, yes, you might raise your eyebrows when you hear that marketing claim, and believe me, I did exactly the same as you. After all, we live in the real world, and that means that practically everything is driven by fossil fuels at the moment. Now, clearly, that needs to change, and the drive to net zero is firmly on the radar screens of many decision makers. But that hasn't stopped some beauty brands already starting to claim to be fossil fuel free. So you're in luck, because Anna Green is back on the podcast with me today to join me as we unpick and, yes, bury the topic of fossil fuel free beauty. Settle in, grab a cup of tea or coffee, plug in your ear pods and relax as we get fired up about fossil fuels in the beauty industry. Welcome to Green Beauty Conversations, the podcast that challenges you to think about how you buy, use, make or sell your green beauty formulations. In my weekly episodes, I explore the sustainability of the beauty industry and encourage you to join me in changing the beauty industry for the better. I'm your host, Lorraine Dallmeier. I'm a chartered environmentalist, biologist, and the CEO of award-winning online organic cosmetic formulation school, Formula Botanica. We have thousands and thousands of students in over 180 countries around the world who study with us to become organic beauty formulators and entrepreneurs. Visit our website at formulabotanica.com to try our free online formulation course. And if you want to be the first person to know what's happening in green beauty, make sure you subscribe to this podcast in your favorite podcast app. So in today's episode, I'm joined by Anna Green, Formula Botanica Education Manager, longtime beauty industry expert, and regular guest on the Green Beauty Conversations podcast. Anna has a wealth of experience in understanding beauty brands, trends, cosmetic ingredients, and everything to do with the wider industry. She manages our education team at Formula Botanica, who oversee our award-winning online courses and our amazing accredited continuing professional development membership site, The Lab at Formula Botanica. It is always a pleasure and a privilege to have Anna on the podcast with me. So let's get started. Hi, Anna. How are you doing today?
Hi, Lorraine. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Oh, I always love having you on. We've done some amazing episodes over the last few years, and I do recommend to all our listeners that you go and have a listen. And I'll link all of those at the end of this episode. But before we get ahead of ourselves, today we're talking about a fascinating topic, which is fossil fuel-free beauty. So I think let's start at the top. What are fossil fuels?
So fossil fuels are fuel sources that are made from decomposing plants and animals that are found in the Earth's crust. It sounds very fancy, but essentially some examples of fossil fuels are things like coal, oil, and natural gas. And to give some context to this conversation, around 80% of the fuel used in the US to power and heat homes comes from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are a massive part of our lives. And when you start to break things down industry by industry, we see just how many of these industries use these fuel sources. So everything from agriculture to transport to heating our homes. And the interesting thing about fossil fuels is that they are finite. So they will run out at some point. These are finite sources. And there is a lot of work happening to find alternatives to fossil fuels. For example, oil is the number one source of fuel for cars for the most part, but we've got a drive for electric cars, for example, which is an alternative fuel source. And these are growing in popularity. But at the moment, the mainstream is fossil fuels for these kinds of things. So yeah, it's very interesting. It's a big part of our lives.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Absolutely everywhere, which is, of course, it forms the crux of what we're going to talk about today in this podcast, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely it does. So Lorraine, how are fossil fuels used in the beauty industry?
Well, they're used everywhere, basically, and pretty much everywhere. And that's the thing that I think underpins this whole conversation that we're having about fossil fuel-free beauty. Is it even possible? But we'll come to that one at the end of the episode, obviously. So if we just break it down, let's start with the ingredients, because obviously the mainstream beauty industry relies really heavily on plastics and fossil fuel-based ingredients. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. Even if you use natural ingredients, of course, they still need to be grown and harvested, and fossil fuels play a big role in that because that's the way that our societies have been set up. Now, obviously, this needs to change, and we're going to talk more about that as well later in the podcast, but fossil fuels are everywhere. And if you are interested in learning more about all of the plastics used by the mainstream industry, we covered a whole load of this on the podcast for Plastic Free July in 2022. So do head back and listen to those episodes. But then if we come back to growing and harvesting natural ingredients, which is, of course, what the majority of our listeners will be interested in. So I looked up a little bit about the effects of agriculture, or the impact of agriculture in terms of greenhouse gases. And according to the International Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, they're the body that produced the big reports on the effects of the climate crisis. They say that agriculture accounts for about 10% of human-made greenhouse gases. Now, admittedly, a lot of that comes from farming animals who produce methane, which is also a greenhouse gas. But a significant amount of our greenhouse gases also come from microbial decay or the burning of plant litter and soil organic matter. So even if you're using natural ingredients, there will still be fossil fuels involved at some point. Now, next up, there's the packaging. We've all heard the terrifying figures used by the beauty industry. Some people say over 120 billion units of plastic packaging per year. And that plastic also comes from fossil fuels. Now, you can, of course, avoid plastic packaging, and you can use aluminium or glass or paper. But the production of those packaging types also emits greenhouse gases, also uses fossil fuels. And then, of course, there's the shipping. Now, at the moment, there are hardly any shipping options that avoid fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases. To be fair, I have a chocolate subscription, a bit of a chocoholic. And there's this amazing chocolate company in the Netherlands that ships its cocoa beans across the Atlantic by sailboat. But let's be fair, they are in the tiny, tiny minority because no one else is really doing that, particularly not at a global level. And global shipping emits 3% of worldwide greenhouse gases, so it's not insignificant. And then, of course, there's the fossil fuels associated with using beauty products, which we do at home, and disposing of beauty products, and recycling of packaging and beauty products. I mean, the list goes on and on. The point, of course, is that we live in a world that just relies so significantly on the combustion engine, on fossil fuels. We're not suddenly going to cut out fossil fuels from how we live without making some fairly sweeping changes to society. And this is happening in some places, but as we all know, it's slow, possibly too slow, and it's probably not enough at the moment. So the beauty industry uses fossil fuels literally everywhere, which of course won't surprise you either, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely. It is amazing how many places fossil fuels are found that we don't really think about on an everyday basis. They do tend to sneak in absolutely everywhere.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the term fossil fuel free beauty then, because that's obviously what today's podcast is about. How are people using this term in the beauty industry? What have you seen?
It's really interesting because it's an interesting term. The majority of people who use the term fossil fuel free beauty are referring to products that are free from petroleum-based ingredients within the formula itself. So products that are formulated without mineral oil or other petroleum-based ingredients. And there's lots and lots of derivatives within the beauty industry that, even though they don't say petroleum or mineral oil, will be derived from these ingredients, for they're derived from the petrochemical industry. You've already talked about it a little bit, but if we think about all aspects of a product beyond just the ingredients label and factor in things like transportation, packaging, manufacturing, then those areas are usually reliant on fossil fuels. So this is a claim overall for your entire business that is incredibly difficult to make. So people tend to make it for the ingredients within the products. You may also see other terms, so petrochemical free or petroleum free are quite popular claims, again, because they're referring to the ingredients within the product, generally referring to the fact that something is naturally based and not using petroleum based ingredients. And you often find these claims on websites and brand social media, etc. But as you've already sort of highlighted, the realities of removing fossil fuels entirely from a business are incredibly, incredibly complex. So these marketing claims struggle to reflect the complexity of that. I think if a consumer picked something up and saw fossil fuel free beauty, they may not understand just how complex that is.
That makes perfect sense. I'm sure it does confuse people. And I don't know if there are any certification schemes or labels yet around this, but no doubt they will pop up at some point, and that will just confuse people even more, I'm sure.
Yeah, there are a few that I've had a look at. And again, they are quite vague and they're very new. And the difficulty, even when you're just looking at ingredients within the beauty industry, is that there's so many of the functional ingredients, as we've already mentioned, are derived from petrochemical sources. And things like solubilizers, emulsifiers, surfactants, even emollients. So simply looking for petroleum-free or petrochemical-free on a label, it's difficult for the average consumer to know whether that's a true claim or not, if we're honest, because they're not experts on reading ingredient labels. So it's very, very tricky. So Lorraine, is it possible to actually find fossil fuel-free beauty anywhere? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit already. We've set this up, but is it possible?
I think it's possible to find beauty formulations that don't contain fossil fuel derived ingredients. Like, I'm going to put that one out there right now. And I think our students at Formula Botanica know this really well. Interestingly, I was giving an interview last week to a mainstream beauty industry publication, and they even said to me, the interviewer said, but it's not possible to make purely 100% purely organic formulations. At which point, of course, I had to yet again point out that that is possible, because you can make really simple, beautiful anhydrous formulations that can be 100% organic, as they don't contain water or any fillers or anything like that. But this whole concept of fossil fuel-free beauty, it's clearly not grounded in reality. It's a little bit like the waterless beauty conversation that you and I had on the podcast I think about 1 or 2 years ago now. And we pointed out that just because your formulation doesn't contain water doesn't mean that you don't have a water footprint for your products, because you still need water to grow the ingredients and make the product and ship the product and use the product. And you can't just go, it's waterless in the bottle, therefore the whole thing is waterless, because it almost sort of greenwashes the whole thing. And I fear that the beauty industry tries to latch onto these concepts that are just a bit meaningless in the face of reality. It's great to aspire to creating fossil fuel-free beauty. I mean, that's something all of us should do, and it's undoubtedly going to be a necessity for our future, but it's certainly not the place we're in now. And anyone claiming to be making fossil fuel-free beauty probably needs a little bit of a reality check. Now, I actually had a guest who I won't name, and they pitched, or their PR agent pitched for that person to come onto the podcast to actually talk about this topic, which is why we're recording it today. Because I immediately went back to the agent and went, oh yeah, let's bring it on. Let's talk about fossil fuel-free beauty on the podcast. But I will be challenging your client heavily. And here are some of the questions I'm going to be asking. And the PR agent was like, no, they're definitely up for the challenge. And then, because I never like my guests to be caught out. Like, I don't host any podcasts where I'm springing sorts of challenging questions on people without them knowing it beforehand. And they were adamant that really wouldn't be a problem. But then on the day of recording, my guest actually ghosted me and didn't turn up, and we never heard from them again. And at that point, I thought, oh, well, it's probably for the best. And that's, of course, why you and I are now recording this podcast, because I really wanted us to ground this conversation in reality rather than just fluff over the fact that fossil fuels are used everywhere. A bit of controversy there. I don't normally share stories like that on the podcast, but I think it's worth pointing out that sometimes these topics arise out of necessity because we need to talk about them before someone else really runs with that conversation. So let's talk about one of the best known fossil fuel derived ingredients then, which is petroleum jelly. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Because I know you've done a little bit of digging into this topic. Yeah,
it's a really interesting story, actually, how petroleum jelly was sort of discovered as a cosmetic ingredient. And it was a product in itself when it was sort of first arrived, and it still is. So it was discovered it's a byproduct of the oil industry, and it was discovered by a chemist called Robert Augustus Cheeseborough. And it dates all the way back to 1859, which is very, very impressive. When the thick oil, which was clogging up the machines on the oil drilling sites, it's a mixture of mineral oils and waxes, and it was found by the oil workers to make their skin really soft and to have benefits for their skin. And that is the substance that has gone on to be known as Vaseline. And of course, Vaseline not only is an ingredient, but it's a brand name. It's a trademarked name of a brand that endures today. So it's come all the way from 1859 and it still goes on. Now, I have to say, I think Robert Cheeseborough was something of a marketing genius, because as well as a chemist, he used to do these live demonstrations where he would deliberately, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this, disclaimer, but he would deliberately burn himself and hurt himself during the demonstrations. And he would apply his product, which is Vaseline, petroleum jelly, to his skin to demonstrate the abilities that it had. His claim was to heal the skin. Now, we know now, science tells us that although Vaseline doesn't have the ability to heal wounds, what it does is it creates an occlusive layer over wounds, and it prevents dirt, water, oil, and other contaminants getting into the skin. So he was onto something. Obviously, his marketing claims were slightly overblown, but he was onto something there, because when you look at that time, one of the main sort of causes of death would be that people would die of infection. So, they would get a wound on their skin, it would get infected, and there was very little treatment then for a skin infection like that. So he discovered this sort of occlusive power of Vaseline. And I think that's where it has become something of an enduring brand for that reason, because he clearly went to great lengths to market his product. He was also, it's fascinating when you think about it now, standing and burning yourself in front of a crowd of people, but it worked for him. And he was also one of the first people to ever offer free sample opportunities for petroleum jelly. So that in itself was quite revolutionary. It's not something that people did at that time. So I think in many ways, Robert was a bit of a trailblazer. And as Vaseline is a byproduct, mineral oil is a byproduct of an industry that already exists. It's very, very inexpensive because it's something that's already there and already created. And it's known today to be highly, highly purified. So cosmetic grade mineral oil has to be purified because it has certain substances which are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are listed as carcinogenic. So the purification process removes those, leaving something that is quite inert behind. And in the EU, there are very stringent requirements for the purification process, and records must be kept. But I think there is quite a lot of urban legend and controversy around mineral oil and Vaseline. And part of it stems from the fact that it needs to be purified and these hydrocarbons that are removed. But as we've said, there's a lot of record keeping and things that are required by the EU for that. But it has quite a story behind it, I think, Vaseline. When you look at a tub of Vaseline, I don't think you can ever look at it the same way again.
No. Gosh, isn't that fascinating? Please, if there are any beauty brands listening to this episode, I'm sure there are many, don't burn yourself to try and sell your products. That is nuts. And the more I learn about the history of the beauty industry, the more I realize that this whole industry is just built on insanity. But anyway, fascinating story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Lorraine, we've talked a little bit about the controversy behind Vaseline, but why are fossil fuels themselves so controversial? What is some of the story behind that?
Well, I think the main thing, and I know our listeners will be familiar with this topic, is that fossil fuels, so coal, oil, gas, they're by far the largest contributor to the global climate crisis. And it is a crisis. According to the UN, fossil fuels account for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. So it's pretty significant. Now, although I'm sure most of our listeners know how this works, let me just run it through it anyway. Your greenhouse gas emissions trap the sun's heat. And that then is leading to a significant change in our climate. And the world is now warming faster than at any point in our recorded history. And these warmer temperatures are changing weather patterns. They're disrupting our ecological systems. The risks are huge. And last year, the UN Secretary General called this Code Red for Humanity. And one of the last year's IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, concluded that the window for securing a livable future for all of us is still there, but it's rapidly closing. And those are pretty shocking words, a livable future. So we all need to be thinking about this. And I know that some governments around the world are. I know that also many of them aren't really pushing that agenda forward as hard as they need to be at the moment. So that's why when you hear beauty brands talk about fossil fuel free beauty, I think it's really worth just scratching the surface to go, is this really a claim that we can be making? And is it something we should be aspiring to? As I said earlier, absolutely. I think we should absolutely hold that up as the gold standard for where we need to get the beauty industry. But yeah, we're not there at the moment, are we? No. So what are the alternatives for fossil fuels in beauty?
Well, there's many alternatives to petrochemical-based ingredients now. We are Formula Botanica. We are the online leading specialist in organic formulation. And, we have more and more natural ingredients, and there's different shades of natural. We have a whole podcast on this, but we have more and more natural ingredients available to us that are plant-based. So in terms of the ingredients themselves, things like vegetable oils, waxes, butters, all fall into the category of petrochemical free in their origin because they are plant-based. They come from plants. So that's a nice, easy one. As you've already pointed out, though, these ingredients will often have fossil fuels used somewhere in their sort of production. So whether that's shipping or the agriculture, depends on how they're sort of harvested, that kind of thing, depends on the ingredient, which methods are used. There's a lot of functional ingredients coming onto the market that avoid the use of petrochemicals. And this is because the natural beauty industry has been growing now for a long time. It's still growing, and there has been a demand for petrochemical-free functional ingredients, things like emulsifiers, surfactants, so anything that sort of will bind oil and water together, things that make things foam, that kind of thing. The beauty industry is responding to that. So ingredients manufacturers are putting out more and more ingredients that are either based on things like green chemistry or plant-derived sort of ingredients that have gone through some processing to make them a functional ingredient that can substitute a petrochemical-based ingredient in a formula. You've also got renewable energy sources that are alternatives to fossil fuels that can be used for things like manufacturing. So an example is that I saw a great article about a beauty brand who have what they've called an eco factory, essentially. And they've got solar panels on their eco factory. So part of their production and their manufacturing is all powered by solar panels that they have installed in the eco factory. So, this isn't something that's going to be accessible to every single indie brand, but it's an interesting concept. It's putting in sort of those renewable sources. I think we have to say as well, just because something is petrochemical free, fossil fuel free, or renewable, it doesn't mean that there won't be an impact elsewhere in terms of sustainability. So it's not going to be always as simple as something's petrochemical free, so therefore it's always going to be better. As you've said, the industry, the world as a whole needs to be moving away from finite sources to things that are renewable, but we also need to take care to choose good options in terms of the renewables that we're using so that we're not having impact elsewhere in terms of sustainability. So it's a very interesting conversation because there's lots of grey areas here, but I think it's worth us considering what the options are in terms of both the ingredients within the products, but also the general production within the beauty industry.
Lots of things to consider, which I'm sure makes some people's heads spin. But on the other hand, as I've said in a couple of earlier episodes, it's the eco-beauty pioneers of today that I think will be the giants of tomorrow, potentially. So another interesting conundrum for people to unpick. So do you think the term fossil fuel-free beauty then has the potential to become the next big thing in the beauty industry?
I think it's a very confusing term. As we've already said, there is no formal definition of what fossil fuel-free beauty is. There's also all the other terms and definitions that mean similar things. I don't think most average consumers would pick up a bottle and understand what fossil-free beauty would mean. And I think there is a high chance of, as you've said before, the beauty industry, and especially sort of the marketing agencies behind the beauty industry, picking up this term and applying it in a way that isn't 100% factual. And there is a lot of nuance to this topic, and I think we need to acknowledge that. It can be subject to greenwashing, and we know now that claims and sustainability claims in particular are under a lot of scrutiny in the beauty industry. And it's not a claim that brands should be making lightly. If they want to claim that their ingredients are petrochemical free, then obviously that is something that can be substantiated. But if they're implying that their entire chain of production and shipping and transport and their entire business is free of fossil fuels, that is something that would make me very, very skeptical if I saw it as a marketing claim. And I would instantly distrust that brand because it's so complex.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of those terms that could very easily get hijacked and completely taken out of context again, much like with the waterless conversation. And people become so fixated on what's in the bottle that I don't think they always think about the wider impacts of the overall formulation and the product and the company. And so, yes, I agree with you. Let's phase out fossil fuels from the beauty industry, but let's also do so with our eyes wide open rather than making claims right now that aren't necessarily grounded in reality. So thank you, Anna, for joining me for another really interesting podcast. And I don't think many people are really talking about this yet, apart from a few brands making these claims. So I'm glad we got in there early. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Lorraine. I really enjoyed this one. It gave me lots of food for thought, and I think it's one that we'll see evolve over the next coming months and years.
I agree. We often get targeted or contacted by media organizations after we podcast like this because we're the only ones talking about the topics that we're covering. So I have no doubt that there will be media requests coming our way now about fossil fuel free beauty. But I'm glad that we're in on the conversation now because it could very easily go the wrong way. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. Lovely to see you again.
Thanks, Lorraine.
Bye. I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Have you seen any beauty brands make fossil fuel-free claims? What do you think about it? Please do come and leave us a comment on our social channels, as both the Formula Botanica team and I love hearing from you. And if you want to hear more about some of the topics we covered, please do delve back into the podcast archives. There are so many episodes to enjoy. Go and listen to episode 87, in which I interview Formula Botanica graduates Elsie and Dominica of Bybee Beauty. And I ask them whether it's possible to sink carbon while selling skincare. Or episode 83, in which I was also joined by Anna to ask whether waterless beauty is the future, or whether the term is just marketing hype, a bit like today's episode. Or head over back to episode 70, in which Anna and I unpicked the topic of biodegradability in beauty, which admittedly generated a flood of media requests afterwards because no one else was making any sense on this topic. There's a wealth of information in our old episodes, and I do encourage you to go back and listen to them. Thank you for joining Anna and I for this latest episode of Green Beauty Conversations. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do leave us a 5-star review so that other people can enjoy these conversations too. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever your favorite podcast app is, and stay tuned for the next episode. Follow Formula Botanica at Formula Botanica on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn, we're everywhere. And come and give me a follow at Lorraine Dallmeier on Instagram, where I talk a lot about sustainable beauty. Visit our website at formulabotanica.com and sign up for our free online formulation course today.